We'll take a photo of all of us today.
We must.
Cynthia.
Indeed.
Daddy the Yana.
Cynthia's already in the picture, huh?
Oh, she's already there.
It's true.
And everyone. The problem is when you take photos with Cynthia, she make all of you guys look bad.
Correct.
Remember, she's our boss, though.
That's the last picture ever.
A story a day.
Take me to Zimbabwe. Don't take me anywhere else. The Zimbabwe is under siege. Can you keep it?
Absolutely.
You have something to say about?
Man, I love that country, Jalas. I've covered it, like they say, severally. So yes, I have.
Rhodesia.
It was known as Northern Rhodesia because there's Southern Rhodesia. There's Zambia. Wait, no. It was known as Southern Rhodesia, sorry. Northern Rhodesia was Zambia. Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Capital before independence, Salisbury.
Salisbury.
It was known as Salisbury.
Who calls a capital in Africa Salisbury? I'm used to Kampala, Nairobi,
Entebbe.
Yeah.
It was known, the Muzungus called it Salisbury.
Salisbury?
Yes.
It was heavily white, eh?
Extremely jealous. And you know why? Because the weather, the climate was just like the UK. Incredible, beautiful, lovely, rolling hills. And by the way, Zimbabwe itself means how can I forget? It means Zimbabwe is the rocks of Zimbabwe. So something that's made of stone, made of stone. Is what Zimbabwe means. And there is there's some ruins in the south of the country known as the Zimbabwe ruins, right? So a country that's made of stone. And listen to this, it's now the stones are coming undone. It's crumbling. But in the meantime, so independence, 1980, and before that they had fought a horrific civil war, Jalas. I mean, Mugabe was in exile for many years. They were chasing him, a guy called Ian Smith, who was prime minister before, the last white prime minister of what was Southern Rhodesia then. He was tracking down Mugabe, and there was a horrific civil war. Mugabe had to flee, was living in Mozambique for many years, also made it all the way to Ghana in the early years, and he was teaching in Ghana. He was a teacher, an ordinary teacher in Ghana. And of course, Ghana, having been the first sub-Sahara country to get independence in 1957, they were granting a lot. Even Thabo Mbeki spent time in Ghana. A lot of these liberation leaders passed through Ghana. Ghana was very open to these the frontline states. So anyway, he gets to Ghana, he's teaching, he meets this woman and marries her. Her name is Sarah, Ghanaian. Cut a long story short, they end up going back to Zimbabwe. Elections are held in 1979. He's elected, becomes president. So he's president and he's brought his Ghanaian wife over. And they loved her and she loved him. And, the Zimbabweans really accepted her. Fantastic woman. Fast forward, Sarah gets cancer. She's suffering. And those days, cancer, once it hits you, it's debilitating. So her health deteriorates, but Mugabe's there by her side, and then Sarah dies, and then he marries his assistant in the office of the president, whose name is Grace.
So can we bring that here? back, maybe in this room here. So
go on.
So Jaber passes on.
Yes,
and Cynthia Boss Lady takes over. So meaning he was already tapping somebody's back while wifey was sick. These secretaries, the law is very clear. We shall revisit.
Yes. She was taking some shorthand.
We shall revisit.
So he marries Grace, and they have some, obviously they have, I think, 3 or 4 children, huh? So anyway, the first 10 years of Mugabe's rule, I mean, he was the darling of the West, although there was one incident in southern Zimbabwe that's horrific where 20,000 people, it was called Matabeleland Massacre. Because, Mugabe is from the Shona tribe, which is the majority, the Shona, and then there's the Ndebeles, who spill over into South Africa. Huge massacre in southern Zimbabwe. And they call it Matabeleland, or the Muzungus, Matabele land. And 20,000 people were massacred by troops because they were agitating. What? Yes. And they were led by a guy called Joshua Nkomo, who also fought in the Liberation War, was left out of government, and his people were now agitating. So when we fast forward 1990s, Mugabe is still in power, and it's still there's no animosity. I mean, Zimbabwe is doing fantastically well. Then 1990, Mandela is released from prison, February 1990, next door. And since Mugabe was the darling of the West, all of a sudden there's a new darling of the West because of this guy Madiba. He's come out, he's forgiving, he says we'll have elections, he says that South Africa will not go the way of other African countries, and Mandela becomes the darling of the West. In the meantime, Mugabe is agitating to the UK saying, hey, listen, at independence in 1980, you promised that all these white-owned lands would revert back to black farmers. When is this going to happen? Like you did in Kenya, where you give compensation and it's willing buyer, willing seller, but you offer the funds. The UK said, you know what, that happened during Margaret Thatcher's time. That's not our time. That's why, fast forward to 2000, the land invasions began in Zimbabwe, where the so-called war veterans decided, you know what, let's invade. Let's just go. Let's invade these white-owned lands. They ended up killing 12 white farmers when we were there. We arrived there in April 2000. Right after the floods in Mozambique, we headed up to Zimbabwe, and the white farmers were being invaded by these so-called war veterans. When you look at the war veterans, they were kids in their 20s. Which war did they fight? Because, independence was 20 years before. They had just been born in 1980. How could they have been war veterans? And they're 20 years old. But anyway, the land invasions continued. White farmers fled in droves. And these are people who owned tens of thousands of acres of wheat farms, corn farms, maize farms. And they were the breadbasket, Zimbabwe, the breadbasket of Southern Africa. Now these guys are fleeing. The people taking over have no clue about how to farm. Have no clue. They're tractors, these huge combine harvesters.
Combine harvesters.
Yes, they're left in the fields to rot.
Can you imagine?
No one knows how to operate them. This economy tanked like crazy. Tanked. So we arrived there and we're following these stories. And we want to get a reaction. So we're told that this guy I told you about, Ian Smith, former prime minister, he's living in a town about 300 kilometers south. We get in the car, we drive all the way down to a place called Gweru. We arrive and we're asking directions. Ian Smith. They say, yeah, that house there. We arrive at this former prime minister's house. Guess what? No security, no guard at the gate. The gate is open.
So the gate is drive in.
We just drove in.
And found him?
We knocked on the door. Guess who opened the door?
No.
Ian Smith.
What?
Former prime minister of Rhodesia. Alone. Can you imagine? So we interviewed him, we talked about it, of course, the usual stuff. Oh, these people, they took over, they finished this country. The usual thing that he would say. So anyway, we got an interview with him. Came back to Harare, 300 kilometers, drove back to Harare, and we said, you know what, let's balance this interview. Let's try and see if we can get Mugabe. Where does he hang out? Let's try. Why not? So we found out, made a few phone calls like I did this morning, and was told, okay, tomorrow morning he's going to be at this church service at this place. Go.
You set up.
We arrived an hour before. Sure enough, the convoy arrives. Mugabe's in church. He's there for 2-3 hours and we're waiting outside very patiently. As the church service finishes, the man is coming out and his security was like nothing you've ever seen, man. These people, they grab you by the you-know-what and they shove you out of the way, man. They don't care.
Grab you by the balls?
My friend.
And shove you out of the way?
My friend.
How painful?
It's like, sorry.
Oh my God!
Yes,
I know how Bologna can be painful anytime they are grabbed.
But I said, you know what? We waited too long.
So did they Bologna you?
Oh, they tried. And I said, Mr. President,
Mr. President,
yeah,
CNN.
And he said, oh, how are you, young man?
From CNN.
Yeah. What do you want to know? So now the bodyguards, they let you go. Once he acknowledges you and sees you, eye contact.
They used to know you everywhere in this continent.
This network, man, it's TV. They see you once, it's like they know you. So that was good access at least. So he sees us and he now lets us in. And we shove the mic in his face. Say, Mr. President, the former Prime Minister Ian Smith is saying A, B, C, D, E. He says, you've destroyed this country. What do you have to say? Of course, Mugabe, a man who holds 7 degrees and, he speaks English like the English man, gave a response. I forget what he said, but, he gave a very eloquent response. And we kept going, for 2, 3, 4, and that's a lot of time, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes of the guy. And he's in no hurry. And the bodyguards are wondering, should we shove this guy? Should we stop the interview? And we're saying no. And the man is still speaking. As long as you're asking a question and he's answering, you're okay. So when we get what we need and the guy says, okay, we have to go. And of course, the bodyguards close in. He gets into his car. Boom, they're gone. But we had our interview. We go back. We combine that with Ian Smith saying this, Mugabe saying this, and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So this guy was, once he acknowledged you and talked to you, you could get a decent conversation going. But the other time when he started going downhill, they held a referendum in 1998 where they were going to decide about multi-party, just like us, multi-party. And Mugabe lost his first ever referendum. And the person who led that referendum was a guy called Morgan Tsvangirai, who became the official opposition leader of the MDC, Movement for Democratic Change, they called it. So in 2000, they had an election. Of course, Mugabe won. 2005, they held an election, Mugabe, and subsequent election. And Morgan, lost credibility along the way. But Mugabe held on to power, whether by crook or hook by crook, he held on to power until now, I guess yesterday or the day before, whatever it was. But that man was smart, and he was brilliant. He was always, despite the age, and he grew old and clung to power and didn't know when to quit, which is a big, big problem in Africa, not knowing when to quit. Because if you think about it now, what's going to happen? So this Grace wife, allegedly, has been manipulating throughout, got all the people around him fired. From Mujuru, the vice president, to now Mnangagwa, who's gone. And these are people who fought for the liberation of Zimbabwe. What's going to happen now? And why? Because she wanted to become vice president and then automatically succeed him? For what? Wow. And what's going to happen now? She's going to have to flee the country? Go where? She's wanted in South Africa for allegedly slapping her son's girlfriend the other day. And that arrogance, and they say that she goes shopping in the UK and spends $10 million or whatever it is in one shopping spree. Where is she going to go? Wow. Which country will accept her? Maybe one of those Asian countries where they have ties or houses or, apartments.
Can you read your quote of the day again?
From Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi?
Because it summarizes the whole story.
The quote: "The day the power of love overrules the love of power, the world will know peace."
And that's what we call
a story a day.
Join the world of Viusasa Entertainment and enjoy the videos you love. SMS the word Viusasa to 40984. Choose your preferred package plan. Select the amount for your chosen package plan, then click Next. Viusasa, connecting you to the videos you love.
You're now rocking with the best, man.
It's the Hot Breakfast with Jeff and Jalango.